Among the first responders is my next guest. Anita Ryan is her name. She's a retired NYPD Sergeant, and she joins us on the phone. Anita, good to have you with us today. Thank you.
Hi, Vince. Thank you for having me.
It is nice to chat with you. Anita, tell us a little bit about yourself. How long were you in the NYPD for?
Vince, I was getting ready to retire 6 weeks after 9/11. So I went into work that day, very excited, having just dropped my family off at school, and we had just moved into a new neighborhood, and I was driving into work in Brooklyn when I looked up and saw a massive explosion, realizing it was the Twin Tower. I contacted my parents, who had a good view of the towers from where they lived in Brooklyn, and they told me that they heard that a plane had crashed into it. So I continued and headed on into work, knowing that this was going to be a very different day in my career.
What did you find when you arrived at work?
Well, it was very chaotic, needless to say. Nobody knew exactly what happened, but anybody who had any knowledge of terrorist attacks kind of knew right away that this was probably a terrorist attack. We lost a lot of communication immediately between police radios, cell phones. So there was very little communication between the NYPD and what was actually going on over there. I actually had one of the only cell phones that were working. And at the time, I was an aide to the police chief in Brooklyn. So I was trying to reach out to him to tell him that we had something major going on. He needed to get in, and he made it in rather quickly. We turned on the news like everybody else because that was our means of communication. And when we realized the second plane had hit, it was inevitable that it was a terrorist attack.
Yes.
And the mode that we went into was we needed to shut down the bridges, the tunnels, and everything else because we didn't know the extent of any further attacks.
Yes.
So the chief and I started to head into the city right away when we realized that the only way for these people to get out was to get on boats, and mostly civilian boats were helping people across the water. So by the time we reached Manhattan and got into the city, both towers had fell. And needless to say, it was, by the time I got there, it had already collapsed, but it was just a thick cloud of dust and debris. You couldn't see much. It was hard to breathe.
Yes.
There was really no communication at all. There was still no radio service, no cell service, but everybody just went into rescuing it to the best that they could in those conditions.
You know, I've talked, Anita, to other NYPD veterans of 9/11, and the impression I've had, the mood was that they almost became members of the military for a moment. That you were drafted into a war that you didn't expect, and all of a sudden now your head's on a swivel. You're concerned that another attack could come from any direction at any moment. That there was just an immense amount of vigilance at that moment by the police officers in that city.
That's exactly what it was like. And being in the department for 20 years and, knowing that we were the biggest and the best equipped in the country, if not the world, you knew on this day that there was no way for us to handle this. This scale of destruction was just not in our guides. We were not trained for it. There was no way for us to have a plan here. So there was no plan. It was every person for themselves doing what they were trained to do, trying to rescue, trying to save lives. But
yes.
I can tell you, Vince, from the minute that we arrived there, we knew that there were no survivors. And that was very hard to comprehend to anybody outside of that area. It was hard to explain that, nobody survived. And that's the way it was. You were walking through this area of total destruction, knee deep in water, sewerage, just, the collapses around us, trying to get into buildings, and still thinking that I was never going home, still thinking that I was never going to see my family. Nobody that worked there that day could have thought that they were going to even survive after the events, because it just was, the magnitude was just devastating, and you didn't know what was coming down next or what was going to collapse next.
Anita, how do people keep doing their job in that circumstance where you're a first responder, you are surrounded by the certainty of death, there's so much around you, you're witness to it. How do you keep doing your job in that?
In all of it, it's a total sense of disbelief and shock, but you run on urgency and adrenaline, nothing else. You know that you've got to do this. This is what you were trained to do. In my whole 20-year career, there was never a level 4 police mobilization, and there was that day. So you knew that this was different.
What does that mean?
And
what does that mean, a level 4 mobilization?
Level 4 means every able body off duty that's capable of working will come in and work. And that never happened in my 20-year career, but it happened on that day. And so you knew that this was your job, and you had to move on, and you had to do what you had to do. And the adrenaline just kept going, and you kept going. And it stayed like that for months after, 20-hour days, just, hoping to find some sign of life. And there was none, but you wanted to be there for other people, their families, and that's how you moved on.
Anita, obviously being as close to it as you were, being a first responder, you must have known many of the people who perished.
I did know quite a few, and I want to tell you my story that day with the police chief that I worked for. He lost his young nephew, who was a young fireman that day, and his family kept contacting us that we hadn't heard from him, and nobody, in the family heard from him. And then at some point, all of us were able to contact our family and let them know that we were okay and that, we were alive, but, this is where we were. But maybe by midnight that night, we reached a fire chief, and the fire chief pretty much said, anybody that made it out of there, we've accounted for. So if you didn't hear from him, more than likely, he didn't make it. And then it was that at that moment that we knew he lost his young nephew. So there was an urgency for me to help him and get his family through that. And in fact, when they had his service, they never recovered his body. But on the night of his service, there was going to be a funeral mass the next morning, and overnight they recovered his body. And the morning of his service, nobody believed it, but he was actually buried.
Wow.
And the next several months, our drive was to try to go to as many funerals and services that we could, just to be with other families and try to help them out. Most of them, nobody had any human remains. There were just pictures of people, but everybody at that point felt that they had to have some sort of a service. And that's what we did for the next few months.
Anita, I don't think anybody would ever want to be in this situation where this kind of brotherhood and sisterhood is forced. But what is that like? What is the relationship like between the people who were there, the first responders, the survivors, the families? What is that like to this day?
Well, despite unimaginable circumstances, I do remember a lot of those selfless acts, the bravery and the caring, even from the public, which, it was amazing to see our country come together the way it did and care for each other. And, life is different. My perspective on how fragile life is will always be different. But I do know that if it wasn't for all of those acts of bravery to today. That's what our country is based on, caring.
It's just amazing. So tell me, Anita, I understand that, and you can obviously share whatever you'd like, because there have been a lot of people in this circumstance, but there have been long-lasting health effects for the first responders and 9/11, the survivors.
Yes.
And I know you've experienced some of that firsthand.
Yes, I have. And honestly, almost everybody I know that I worked with for all these years, almost everybody I know has some sort of 9/11 health effect. It is very serious. So many cancers, and they're just all coming out today, 20 years later.
Sure.
And I don't think it'll ever stop. And some of the illnesses, mine in particular, I have a few, but I have a rare autoimmune disease that's known to be caused by silica dust. And strangely enough, it's not covered as a 9/11 health condition, which upsets me because that's probably going to be the thing that I die of one day, and it's not recognized. So I think that there needs to be a lot more research, and I hope one day that our government recognizes it and exposes it, and there's more help down the road.
I in preparation for our interview, I did look up some of the basics here, and I understand that there is a number of news articles and a number of scientific journals have dug into this. Even our own government on its websites discusses the relationship between what they refer to as 9/11 exposure and autoimmune disease. So it's clear that there are people within the scientific community who've established that there is some sort of meaningful link here for people like you, first responders, and then autoimmune diseases like the one you have that is now afflicting you. Have you been able to? I mean, it's so unfortunate that you even have to be in this position. But have you talked to members of Congress or anybody who might be able to push this along?
I've tried in the past. I've sent letters. I was told it's being looked into. The doctors, the 9/11 doctors, have all told me they think one day, it will be added. And my own doctors for sure believe that, silica dust is what is cause of this illness. Mm-hmm. And I do know that Camp Lejeune has scleroderma as a listed illness. So the government does know that silica dust causes it. Why 9/11 is left out? I think they're afraid to open up another can of worms. It seems like every time there's another illness, that's more money for the government. I can't understand it. I hope one day I see that change in my lifetime anyway.
Yeah, we have a basic deal in this country, I think, that most people recognize. If you put your life on the line for it, then we will do whatever we can to take care of yours. But and we should fulfill that obligation, I think. And I know a lot of our listeners agree too. Anita,
thank you, Ben.
Anita Ryan, before we let you go, any final thoughts here on the 22nd anniversary of 9/11? What do you think? Obviously, having been as close to it as you were, none of us really, most of us will never have that perspective. But do you think that Americans have a proper perspective on what happened that day?
I do think that they mean well. I think that there's a lot of people that just want to move on from that day. And I don't think it could ever be that way. I hope that one day it becomes a federal holiday. I think it should be. And it should always be recognized and honored. It's a day that our country, came together, a day that our country witnessed such devastation. It'll never, hopefully, ever happen again. But I hope that people don't forget.
Me too.
Because that's when we'll let our hats down and something else will happen.
Me too. We've got to remember. Anita Ryan, thank you very much for your service to your country and for your time today. Really appreciate your time with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Vin. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Such a pleasure to talk to you. It is 4:51 now.